We're going to be talking about East Asia this morning, and first off we'll take a look at the relative location of East Asia, noting its proximity to the Pacific Ocean and recognizing that the western United States and California in particular have an orientation on the Pacific as well, and so we have a very intimate relationship between the economy and the culture of East Asia that has seen its imprint in North America as well. We will recognize 5 regions, and you see China proper dominating East Asia. We have 2 western China provinces, Xizang, which is more commonly known as Tibet, and Xinjiang, which is an area that is going to be populated by minority Uyghurs, which we will talk about more later. The country of Mongolia is recognized as its own region, and then finally the Dakota Triangle, which is a combination of Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. Splendid isolation is a term that has been used to describe China, at least historically, and this isolation is physiographic. The western deserts of China, the Tibetan Plateau, the Himalayas, of course, and then the Pacific Ocean have all created a physical isolation for China, but a characteristic of China as well is its cultural isolation. For a very long time, China was an inward-looking society and civilization, and only in the past few decades has really opened itself out to the world. A population map indicates how population is strongly concentrated in the coastal and eastern regions of China. China proper, of course, Japan and the Koreas populated as well, but western China is quite sparsely populated. China is one of the oldest civilizations on Earth. With some major breakthroughs and contributions to world civilization. The concept of the Pacific Rim is important, especially in the context of globalization. Not to be confused with the Pacific Ring of Fire, which indicates the physiographic or tectonic situation around the Pacific, and we can see the extent of volcanoes and earthquakes that are found in this ring of the Pacific. But note as well that interior China is subject to earthquakes and volcanic eruptions as well. Okay, so a view of the physiography of China, and notably we have these river basins which the Chinese civilization grew up around, and then we have these interior deserts starting with the Gobi Desert, extending inland towards the Tarim Basin, the great Tibetan Plateau, and a number of mountain ranges, the Himalayas of course being the most prominent, but the Kunlun and Tian Shan mountain ranges as well. China has been strongly influenced by the deposit of glacial materials from the Himalayas, which contribute to its agricultural soils. A climate comparison indicates the strong effect of the coastal environment, where the United States has 2 coastlines. China, of course, has this vast interior. Notice that we'll have milder sea climates in the south, colder D climates in the north. Said more generally, we extend from warm in the south to cold in the north, wet in the east, and dry in the west. As I indicated, these major river systems are at the center of Chinese history and Chinese civilization. Historically, China has had a relationship with its neighbors to the north, especially the Mongol hordes, as they were known, which was the motivation for building the Great Wall of China. Today, China has been rapidly developing and building large infrastructure projects, including the world's largest dam, with the displacement of several million people. Tiananmen Square was the center of a lot of Chinese history, including the 1989 student-led protests against the government seeking greater freedoms. The government violently suppressed this uprising, and over the ensuing 30 years, we have seen relative peace and stability within China. Linguistically, you see the dominance of Mandarin Chinese, both Southern and Northern Mandarin Chinese, indicated in the tan colors on the map. And then you see a variety of different ethnic languages that are spoken, most notably Cantonese in the south, which is quite common in Chinatown in San Francisco because many of the migrants came out of these southern areas of China. Tibetan, of course, in the west, and we'll start to see some Turkic languages showing up in the Xinjiang area of China, which is a characteristic that associates it with the Central Asian republics. Specifically, this is the home of the Uyghurs, Tibetans to the south. China is a relatively ethnically homogeneous society, with a majority of its population being Han Chinese. This produces a situation in which the minority, 8% of the population, is often subject to various forms of discrimination. Today, China in particular shows this extreme levels of disparity between the wealth that is being generated in the coastal cities versus the relative poverty of the inland. And this disparity is evident throughout the country. China has seen a rapid urbanization from only 20% urbanized to 50% urbanized today, and this has been largely the product of a rural to urban migration that has been called the largest migration that has ever taken place on Earth, with as many as 300 million people moving from the rural farmlands to the coastal cities. This is a number that is close to that of the entire population of the United States. A friend of mine wrote a book about China from the perspective of her vantage as a professor of political science at CSU Long Beach, and the title of the book I think is quite telling, Accepting Authoritarianism. This is an authoritarian regime with a very strong government that is controlling many aspects of the society, and yet we see this open economic system that has generated a lot of wealth. And her assertion is that the population has essentially come to accept the fact that there are going to be great restrictions on personal freedoms, and that the trade-off is that they were able to generate this wealth and power and influence in the world. So one of the things that is characteristic of China in particular is this modernization, lots and lots of development, lots of high-rise development, lots of ancient neighborhoods and buildings and artifacts that have been essentially bulldozed as we've seen this dramatic progress. But also we see this tremendous amount of pollution, air pollution, water pollution as a consequence of this very rapid development. If we back up some in human history, we can see that there have been numerous outside entities that have at one time or another controlled part of China. And eventually we see a consolidation of China in its modern form following the long march of Mao Zedong, when he consolidated control and established the People's Republic of China as it exists today. We see tremendous upheaval that took place during the World War II era, which we'll talk about shortly. China does have abundant energy resources, most notably coal, which is often quite dirty and is the consequence of a lot of the air pollution that you see. And there have been a lot of moves towards alternative energy, solar and wind, in recognition of the health problems that are being introduced by burning of these very dirty fuels. A characteristic of modern China is the special economic zones, which you see indicated on the map. These are areas that are being given preferential treatment, tax breaks, permitting foreign investment, permitting foreign companies to build factories on Chinese soil. And this is really where we see the economic explosion taking place. And you can see that these are also centered or adjacent to open cities. And these open cities, again, have seen this very rapid development. In some cases, places that were really just sort of backwater towns exploding into cities of 5 and 10 million people. As I mentioned, there's a lot of Western influence, and we've seen a lot of the specific companies and manufacturing of goods that is geared specifically around certain large Western corporations, Walmart being an example. Hong Kong is a fascinating case study for China. It was part of Britain. It was a British colonial holding until 1999. It is now part of China. It is a thriving global financial and economic center, and China has permitted this sort of modern, somewhat Western approach to economics and society, but also has been quick to put the screws down if they feel that Hong Kong is trying to exert too much of its freedoms. Similar situation with Taiwan. This is a very ambiguous political status. Taiwan treats itself as an independent nation state, and yet China is quick to point out that it is historically part of China, and periodically China will send in the military to exert its control. Again, modern economy, and one with great ties to the West. Indeed, many Taiwanese will have traveled or lived in the United States. A little bit of particular attention to Tibet. This was independent until the 1950s when China came in. You can see the Chinese military in the foreground. This is the great temple complex of Lhasa, the center of the Tibetan civilization. And this was a particularly brutal period in which there was destruction of Tibetan culture, artifacts, monasteries, libraries. This is something that we also saw as part of the Cultural Revolution in China during the period of Mao Zedong's rise to power. Lots of Chinese heritage, books, writings were destroyed, and many people were killed along the way. Tibetan Buddhism has received a lot of attention around the world, including having a significant imprint in California. China has now integrated Tibet. There are many Han Chinese that are moving into Tibet, and this has created a situation of poverty among a lot of Tibetans and some unrest. Talking about Xinjiang a little bit. Again, this is this region that is populated by Muslim Uyghurs, which are Turkic peoples. And you can see, in spite of its isolation, some significant resources. Mongolia is considered a buffer state as a result of its proximity sandwiched between China and Russia. And many resources are found here. And so China, for example, has been doing a lot of mining in Mongolia. Okay, moving into talking a little bit about Korea, which is a hot spot. Tremendous disparity between the west-looking South Korea, with its thriving Western economy, and the isolated and underdeveloped North Korea, which has had a lot of association and support from China, which has an interest in seeing North Korea remain as a communist state. Of course, we've heard a lot about the nuclear program in North Korea, one of the great political hotspots. Shifting to talking about Japan a little bit, we'll start off with this comparison, reminding us of the state of Japan's aging population. So Japan, of course, has seen this tremendous impact over its history, and this was recently demonstrated with the devastation of the Fukushima nuclear power plant 6 or 7 years ago, and again is just something that has always been part of Japan's history. See some of the devastation that has been wrought by this tsunami. This is the Fukushima plant. And you want to understand that Japan is very mountainous, so not all of its land is inhabitable, which makes it one of the most densely populated places on Earth. Of course, this is a very urbanized state, and one that has really seen its economy go from being devastated after World War II to becoming industrialized, and a lot of the products that we see today, a lot of the familiar brands, Toyota, Honda, Sony, and the like, where we saw this thriving economy develop in the 1980s and 1990s, and then in recent decades we've seen a little bit of a decline as they start to lose out to competition. Japan during World War II had a very expansionist mentality, and they took over a lot of the adjacent areas, and of course eventually ended up entering into a war against the United States. Following the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we see this period of a post-war occupation, and then this eventual rising from the ashes, as it were. Today we see Japan having some of the highest human development indicators in the world. Here we see the comparison in terms of its ranking with the United States. All right, so that will wrap up our East Asia presentation, and we will see you online.